Hi everyone. I hope you're all doing well today. It's good to see you again, or at least to virtually be with you for another physiology session. Today we'll be talking about a fascinating topic regulation of respiration. This lecture will help you understand how the brain and body work together to control breathing automatically, even without conscious effort. Every breath you take is carefully adjusted to meet the body's needs, especially during exercise, sleep, or stress. By the end of this session, you'll see how precisely the nervous and chemical systems coordinate to maintain stable levels of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the body. Before we begin, let's go over the objectives of this session. By the end of this lecture, you should be able to first, explain the physiologic mechanisms involved in respiration, how the body regulates breathing to meet its needs. Second, understand how chemical factors such as oxygen, carbon dioxide, and hydrogen ions influence breathing control. Third, describe how the peripheral chemoreceptors detect changes in blood gases and relay information to the brain. And lastly, explain how respiration is regulated during exercise. As we go through the discussion, keep these objectives in mind because they will help you connect the basic physiologic concepts to real clinical situations. Let's begin with the role of the nervous system in respiration. The nervous system plays a crucial part in adjusting the rate of alveolar ventilation. That is, how much air reaches the alveoli each minute to match the body's metabolic demands. When you're resting, the brain maintains a steady rhythm of breathing that keeps oxygen and carbon dioxide levels constant. But once you start exercising, your muscles produce more carbon dioxide and use up more oxygen. In response, the nervous system automatically increases both the rate and depth of breathing to maintain homeostasis. In short, the nervous system acts as a built in regulator, continuously fine tuning ventilation to keep your blood gases within normal limits regardless of what you're doing. Now, let's focus on the respiratory center. This is the main control area in the brain that regulates our breathing rhythm. It's part of the nervous system that ensures our breathing adjusts automatically depending on our body's needs. The respiratory center is located bilaterally in the medulla oblongata and the pons, both parts of the brainstem. It's composed of several groups of neurons that communicate closely with each other to generate and modify the pattern of breathing. If you look at the figure, you can see these major areas, the medulla and pons, positioned at the base of the brain. They connect the brain to the spinal cord, allowing respiratory signals to travel down to the respiratory muscles. So, the medulla is mainly responsible for initiating and maintaining the rhythm of breathing, while the pons help smooth out and fine tune that rhythm, making our breathing steady and regular. Now that we know where the respiratory center is located, let's look at how it is organized. It is divided into three major groups of neurons, each with a specific role in controlling the rhythm and pattern of breathing. First, the dorsal respiratory group or DRG, located in the medulla. This group is primarily responsible for inspiration and helps generate the basic rhythm of breathing. Second, the ventral respiratory group or VRG, also in the medulla. This contains both inspiratory and expiratory neurons and it becomes active during forceful breathing, such as during exercise or stress. And third, the pneumotaxic center, which is located in the pons. This area helps regulate the rate and depth of breathing by controlling when inspiration ends. If you look at the figure, you can see how these centers are positioned within the brainstem. They work together continuously. The DRG sets the basic rhythm. The VRG supports stronger breathing when needed. And the pneumotaxic center fine-tunes the timing to keep breathing smooth and well coordinated. The dorsal respiratory group or DRG is located in the dorsal portion of the medulla. This group of neurons is primarily responsible for inspiration. It sends rhythmic signals to the diaphragm via the phrenic nerve, allowing air to enter the lungs. You can think of the DRG as the main rhythm generator for normal, quiet breathing. Even when there's no external input, the neurons in the DRG continue to fire automatically in a rhythmic pattern, ensuring that breathing happens continuously and smoothly. So, in simple terms, the DRG provides the basic rhythm of breathing. It starts the signal that initiates inspiration, and when the signal stops, expiration naturally follows due to the elastic recoil of the lungs. Next, we have the ventral respiratory group or VRG. This group is located in the ventrolateral part of the medulla and contains both inspiratory and expiratory neurons. During quiet breathing, the VRG remains inactive because normal expiration is passive. The lungs simply recoil after inspiration. However, during times when breathing demand increases, like during exercise, stress, or respiratory distress, the VRG becomes active. It sends strong signals to both the inspiratory and expiratory muscles to help move air more forcefully. The VRG, therefore, acts as a kind of overdrive system, stepping in when we need deeper or faster breathing to meet the body's higher oxygen demand. The third part of the respiratory center is the pneumotaxic center, located dorsally in the upper portion of the pons. Its main function is to help regulate the rate and depth of breathing by controlling when inspiration ends. It does this by sending inhibitory signals to the DRG. This is called the switch off point for inspiration. When the pneumotaxic signal is strong, inspiration ends quickly, leading to rapid, shallow breaths. When the signal is weak, inspiration lasts longer, resulting in slower, deeper breathing. In short, the pneumotaxic center serves as a timing control mechanism. It fine-tunes breathing so that the lungs fill appropriately without overinflating. Now that we have identified the three main parts of the respiratory center, let's take a closer look at each one, starting with the dorsal respiratory group or DRG. This group is especially important because it is primarily responsible for inspiration and helps generate the basic rhythm of breathing. In the next few slides, we'll understand exactly how the DRG functions and how it contributes to the rhythmic pattern of respiration. Let's take a closer look at the DRG. These neurons are located in a very important area of the medulla called the nucleus of the tractus solitarius or NTS. The NTS serves as the main site of sensory termination for two cranial nerves, the vagus nerve, which is cranial nerve 10, and the glossopharyngeal nerve, which is cranial nerve 9. Both of these nerves bring sensory information from different parts of the body to the respiratory center. Now, what kind of information do they carry? They transmit signals from number 1, peripheral chemoreceptors. These detect changes in arterial oxygen, carbon dioxide, and pH levels. Number 2, baroreceptors, which provide feedback about blood pressure. Number 3, visceral receptors, found in the liver, pancreas, and other organs that influence breathing through reflexes. And the last one, pulmonary receptors. These are stretch receptors in the lungs that help regulate respiratory rhythm and depth. In short, the DRG acts as a central processing area. It collects all this sensory input, integrates it, and then adjusts breathing accordingly to keep ventilation matched to the body's needs. Now let's talk about how the DRG actually generates the basic rhythm of breathing. Even if all the sensory inputs to the respiratory center are cut off, the neurons in the DRG continue to fire in a rhythmic pattern. This means that the DRG has an intrinsic property that allows it to produce regular, automatic inspiratory signals. Inside the medulla, there are networks of neurons that alternately excite and inhibit each other. This interaction creates a self-sustaining respiratory rhythm, a repeating cycle of inspiration and expiration. In other words, the DRG functions like a built-in pacemaker for breathing. It ensures that the body maintains a continuous, rhythmic pattern of ventilation even when we are unconscious or asleep. This is why breathing continues automatically. We don't have to think about it. Let's now move on to an important structure closely associated with the respiratory rhythm, the pre-Botzinger complex. This group of neurons is located in the rostral part of the ventral respiratory group within the medulla. It contains what we call pacemaker neurons, which play a critical role in generating the rhythmic pattern of breathing. The pre-Botzinger complex sends rhythmic excitatory signals to both the DRG and VRG, helping to synchronize inspiration and expiration. Because of this function, it is often referred to as the central pattern generator for respiration. In simpler terms, you can think of it as the metronome of the respiratory system. It sets the pace for each breath, ensuring that the rhythm remains steady and coordinated. Without the pre-Botzinger complex, normal rhythmic breathing would not be possible. Now that we know the pre-Botzinger complex acts as the pacemaker for breathing, let's look at how it actually drives inspiration through what we call the inspiratory ramp signal. When a nervous signal is sent to the inspiratory muscles, mainly the diaphragm, it doesn't arrive as a sudden burst. Instead, it begins weakly and then gradually increases in strength for about 2 seconds. This gradual rise in activity creates what's known as a ramp-like signal. After this 2-second rise, the signal stops abruptly for about 3 seconds. This pause allows the diaphragm to relax and the lungs to recoil, producing expiration. This rhythmic pattern, A smooth rise, followed by a pause, repeats continuously, giving us a steady and controlled breathing cycle. This ramp pattern has an important advantage. Because the inspiratory signal increases gradually, it allows the lungs to fill smoothly and progressively rather than with a sudden gasp. This gradual filling prevents abrupt changes in lung pressure and airflow, making breathing more comfortable and energy efficient. It also allows the respiratory center to easily adjust the rate and depth of breathing depending on the body's needs, such as when you shift from rest to exercise. Two main factors determine how the inspiratory ramp signals behaves, and these control both the rate and duration of inspiration. The first factor is the rate of increase of the ramp signal. When the body needs more oxygen, such as during exercise, the ramp rises more rapidly. This causes the lungs to fill faster and increases ventilation. The second factor is the limiting point, the moment when the ramp signal stops. If the ramp ends earlier, inspiration becomes shorter and the respiratory rate increases. If the ramp continues longer before stopping, inspiration lasts longer, resulting in slower, deeper breathing. In simple terms, the respiratory center can adjust these two factors, the slope and the stopping point, to control how fast and how deeply we breathe. Now that we've seen how the inspiratory ramp signal works and how it produces smooth, gradual inspiration, let's move on to another structure that helps regulate this process, the pneumotaxic center. This center plays an important role in determining when inspiration should stop, which in turn controls the rate and depth of breathing. Let's look at where it's located and how it works. The pneumotaxic center is located in the upper part of the pons, specifically in an area called the nucleus parabrachialis. Its main function is to control the switch off point of inspiration. In other words, it determines when the inspiratory ramp should stop. By doing this, it limits the duration of inspiration and helps regulate the rate and depth of breathing. If the pneumotaxic signal is strong, inspiration ends sooner. The lungs fill quickly but less deeply, resulting in rapid, shallow breaths. This can reach up to 30 to 40 breaths per minute. On the other hand, if the signal is weak, inspiration lasts longer, producing slower and deeper breathing, around 3 to 5 breaths per minute. So overall, the pneumotaxic center acts like a fine-tuning mechanism. It helps maintain a breathing rhythm that is appropriate for the body's needs. And it also prevents the lungs from overinflating during each cycle. Now that we have covered the role of the pneumotaxic center in controlling the rate and depth of breathing, let's move on to the next important group of neurons, the VRG. While the DRG mainly handles inspiration during quiet breathing, the VRG becomes active when breathing needs to be stronger or more forceful, such as during exercise or respiratory distress. Let's take a closer look at its location and function. The VRG is found in the medulla, extending from the nucleus ambiguus down to the nucleus retroambiguus. This group contains both inspiratory and expiratory neurons, meaning it participates in both phases of breathing when needed. The VRG becomes active during both inspiration and expiration, but under normal conditions, it stays quiet because regular breathing or eupnea doesn't require much effort. Once breathing demand increases, however, the VRG takes over, helping to strengthen inspiration and activate the muscles involved in expiration. The VRG doesn't function the same way as the DRG. Let's look at the three main differences that make the VRG unique. The first difference is that most of the neurons in the VRG remain inactive during quiet breathing or eupnea. During normal, restful breathing, the rhythm of inspiration comes mainly from the pre-Botzinger complex and the DRG, which send rhythmic signals to the diaphragm. Even though the VRG has both inspiratory and expiratory neurons, it only becomes active when breathing demand increases, such as during exercise or stress. That's why we say that VRG is silent at rest but active during forceful breathing. It essentially acts as a reserve system that steps in when ventilation needs to rise beyond normal levels. The second difference is that the VRG helps coordinate the transition from inspiration to expiration. This function is managed by the Botzinger complex, a group of neurons located just above the pre-Botzinger area. The Botzinger complex sends inhibitory signals that stop inspiration, allowing expiration to begin. During quiet breathing, expiration happens passively due to the elastic recoil of the lungs and chest wall. But during active expiration, another group of neurons called the retrotrapezoid nucleus or RTN located in the rostral medulla becomes involved. The RTN acts as a chemosensitive center that responds strongly to increases in carbon dioxide and hydrogen ions, and it also receives input from the carotid bodies. So, the Botzinger complex acts as the off switch for inspiration, while the RTN helps control active expiration and monitors chemical changes in the blood. The third difference is that the VRG becomes especially important during forced expiration and heavy exercise. When breathing becomes labored, the VRG sends powerful expiratory signals to the abdominal muscles to help push air out of the lungs. This mechanism ensures rapid removal of carbon dioxide and maintains acid-base balance. Because of this, the VRG functions as an overdrive mechanism for respiration. It supplements the normal rhythm by increasing the strength of ventilation when oxygen demand and carbon dioxide production rise, such as during strenuous physical activity. In summary, the DRG maintains the normal breathing rhythm, while the VRG provides the extra drive needed for active or forceful breathing. Now that we have discussed the neural components of the respiratory center, the dorsal and ventral respiratory groups, and the pneumotaxic center, let's move on to one of the most important reflex mechanisms that helps regulate breathing, the Herring-Brewer inflation reflex. This reflex acts as a protective feedback system from the lungs to the brain. It prevents the lungs from overinflating and helps maintain a smooth, rhythmic breathing pattern, especially when tidal volume increases during sleep or forceful breathing. Let's look at how this reflex works and why it's important in the regulation of respiration. Here's how the reflex actually works. When the lungs expand during inspiration, stretch receptors in the muscular walls of the bronchi and bronchioles become activated. These receptors send nerve signals through the vagus nerves to the DRG in the medulla. Once the DRG receives these signals, it switches off the inspiratory ramp, stopping further inspiration. This process is very similar to the effect of the pneumotaxic center, since both act to limit inspiration and prevent overinflation. In short, when the lungs are overstretched, vagal signals inhibit further inspiration, allowing expiration to begin and protecting the lungs from damage. The Herring-Brewer reflex mainly acts as a protective mechanism against overinflation rather than as part of the normal control of breathing. It is not activated during quiet breathing because normal tidal volume, about 500 ml, is too small to trigger the reflex. However, when tidal volume exceeds around 1.5 liters per breath, which is about 3 times the normal amount, the reflex becomes active. At that point, stretch receptors send inhibitory signals to stop inspiration, protecting the lungs from excessive inflation. So to summarize, this reflex plays little role during normal breathing, but it becomes very important during deep breathing or exercise when lung volumes are large. It ensures that the lungs expand safely without overstretching, a perfect example of the body's built-in protection for the respiratory system. So far, we have discussed how the nervous system regulates breathing through the respiratory centers in the medulla and pons, and through reflexes like the Herring-Brewer reflex that protect the lungs from overinflation. Now, let's move to another important aspect, the chemical control of respiration. This part of regulation ensures that our breathing adjusts automatically to maintain the proper levels of oxygen, carbon dioxide, and hydrogen ions in the blood. Even small changes in these chemical factors can stimulate the brain to alter the rate and depth of breathing. In the next few slides, we'll explore how increases or decreases in carbon dioxide, oxygen, and hydrogen ions influence respiratory activity, and how specialized chemoreceptors help maintain the body's acid-base balance. The ultimate goal of chemical control of respiration is to maintain proper concentrations of oxygen, carbon dioxide, and hydrogen ions in the tissues. These three are the key chemical factors that determine how the respiratory system adjusts breathing. Let's start with carbon dioxide and hydrogen ions. Both of these act directly on the respiratory center in the medulla. When carbon dioxide or hydrogen ion levels in the blood increase, they stimulate the respiratory center to send stronger signals to the inspiratory and expiratory muscles, leading to deeper and faster breathing. This helps remove excess carbon dioxide from the body and restore acid-base balance. Now, in contrast, oxygen has little direct effect on the brain's respiratory center. Instead, oxygen acts indirectly through peripheral chemoreceptors located in the carotid and aortic bodies. When oxygen levels fall, these chemoreceptors send signals to the medulla to increase ventilation. So to summarize, carbon dioxide and hydrogen ions directly drive the brain's respiratory center, while oxygen acts indirectly through the peripheral chemoreceptors. This combination of central and peripheral control ensures that ventilation precisely matches the body's metabolic needs. Now let's take more closely at how carbon dioxide and hydrogen ions directly influence the respiratory center in the brain. There is a specific region called the chemosensitive area located in the ventral medulla near the surface, about 0.2 millimeters beneath it. This area includes the retrotrapezoid nuclei and contains neurons that are highly sensitive to changes in blood PCO2 and hydrogen ion concentration. When the level of carbon dioxide or hydrogen ion in the blood increases, these neurons become activated. They in turn stimulate other parts of the respiratory center, particularly the inspiratory areas, to increase ventilation. This increased breathing rate and depth help the body remove excess carbon dioxide through the lungs, which lowers the hydrogen ion concentration and helps restore normal acid-base balance. So the process is simple. When carbon dioxide or hydrogen ion rises, the chemosensitive area is activated, leading to a stronger respiratory drive, which then restores normal levels of both carbon dioxide and pH in the blood. Let's now look more closely at how the chemosensitive neurons are actually stimulated. The primary stimulus for these neurons is hydrogen ions. Neurons in the chemosensitive area are especially excited by increases in hydrogen ion concentration. This is the main direct signal that activates them to increase ventilation. However, there's a key point to remember. Hydrogen ions in the blood do not easily cross the blood-brain barrier. Because of that, changes in blood hydrogen ion concentration have only a limited effect on directly stimulating these neurons. Now, this is where carbon dioxide plays an important indirect role. Unlike hydrogen ion, carbon dioxide easily crosses the blood-brain barrier and enters the cerebrospinal fluid. Inside the brain, carbon dioxide reacts with water to form carbonic acid, which then dissociates into hydrogen ion and bicarbonate. This increase in local hydrogen ion concentration in the brain stimulates the chemosensitive neurons, leading to stronger respiratory drive. So, in summary, even though hydrogen ion is the direct stimulus, carbon dioxide is the key driver because it crosses into the brain, forms hydrogen ion locally, and triggers the respiratory center to increase ventilation. Take a closer look at how carbon dioxide indirectly stimulates the respiratory center. First, let's clarify the difference between direct and indirect effects. Carbon dioxide itself has a very little direct effect on the neurons in the chemosensitive area. Instead, it has a very strong indirect effect because once it enters the brain, it leads to the formation of hydrogen ions, and these hydrogen ions are the ones that actually excite the neurons. Now, let's look at the mechanism. Carbon dioxide easily crosses the blood-brain barrier, unlike hydrogen ions which cannot pass through. Once carbon dioxide enters the cerebrospinal fluid and the interstitial fluid of the medulla, it reacts with water to form carbonic acid. This carbonic acid then breaks down into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate. The newly formed hydrogen ions directly stimulate the chemosensitive neurons, causing an increase in respiratory drive. Finally, the physiologic significance. Because of this process, a rise in blood carbon dioxide results in more hydrogen ions being produced inside the medulla. This is why carbon dioxide is considered the most powerful chemical stimulus for increasing respiration. In summary, when carbon dioxide levels increase, it crosses into the brain, forms hydrogen ions, and those hydrogen ions stimulate the chemosensitive neurons to increase ventilation. This mechanism allows the body to respond quickly to even small increases in carbon dioxide, keeping both carbon dioxide and pH levels in balance. Now that we have discussed how carbon dioxide and hydrogen ions stimulate the respiratory center, let's look at what happens when carbon dioxide remains elevated for a longer period of time, like in chronic conditions or sustained hypoventilation. Initially, high levels of carbon dioxide cause a strong increase in respiratory drive. But, interestingly, this effect doesn't stay the same over time. After a day or two, the response of the respiratory center starts to decrease, even if carbon dioxide levels remain high. This is because the body begins to adapt, mainly through the help of the kidneys, which play a key role in regulating acid base balance. So, in the next few slides, let's understand how this adjustment happens and how the respiratory and renal systems work together to maintain homeostasis. To understand this adaptation better, let's look more closely at what happens inside the body. The kidneys play a key role in compensation. They increase the amount of bicarbonate ions in the plasma, which bind with excess hydrogen ions in the blood and cerebrospinal fluid. This reduces the hydrogen ion concentration and lowers the excitatory drive on the respiratory center. Over the next several hours, bicarbonate also diffuses across the blood-brain and cerebrospinal barriers. Once inside the brain, it combines with hydrogen ions near the respiratory neurons, forming carbonic acid and water. This helps bring the hydrogen ion concentration near the medulla back to normal levels. In short, the kidneys and brain work together to stabilize breathing. The kidneys handle the long-term acid-base adjustment while the brain fine-tunes the ventilatory response. Now that we have seen how carbon dioxide levels affect the respiratory center over time, let's look at this graph to understand the quantitative effects of carbon dioxide and hydrogen ions on ventilation. The red curve represents PCO2. Notice how even a small rise in arterial carbon dioxide from about 35 to 75 millimeter mercury produces a large increase in alveolar ventilation. This tells us that carbon dioxide is a very powerful driver of breathing. As soon as carbon dioxide starts to build up, the brain quickly stimulates faster and deeper breathing to remove it. Now, look at the green curve. It represents changes in pH. Even when pH shifts from 7.3 to 7.5, the effect on ventilation is relatively small. This comparison clearly shows that carbon dioxide is the most potent chemical regulator of respiration under normal physiologic conditions, while pH plays a secondary role. Now let's talk about the role of oxygen in regulating breathing. Compared to carbon dioxide, oxygen has a surprisingly minimal direct effect on the brain's respiratory center. Even when oxygen levels fluctuate within their normal range, the respiratory drive remains almost unchanged. This is because the brain's respiratory center, particularly the medulla, is not very sensitive to changes in oxygen concentration. Instead, oxygen affects breathing indirectly through special sensors called peripheral chemoreceptors, which are located in the carotid and aortic bodies. These receptors monitor the oxygen level in arterial blood and send signals to the medulla when oxygen falls too low. The response becomes significant only when the arterial PO2 drops below about 70 millimeter mercury. That's when ventilation increases to bring more oxygen into the lungs. Now that we've seen how oxygen has very little direct effect on the respiratory center in the brain, let's focus on how the body actually senses low oxygen levels, and that's through the peripheral chemoreceptors. These specialized sensors are strategically located in the carotid and aortic bodies where they continuously monitor the oxygen content of arterial blood. When oxygen levels fall, these receptors send rapid signals to the brainstem to increase ventilation, helping restore oxygen back to normal. In the next few slides, we'll look closely at where these receptors are located, how they function, and what happens when arterial oxygen drops below the normal range. Now, let's look more closely at the peripheral chemoreceptors. These are specialized chemical sensors located outside the brain. These chemoreceptors are located into two main areas, the carotid bodies and the aortic bodies. Their main job is to detect changes in arterial oxygen levels or PO2. They are most sensitive to a drop in oxygen, but they can also respond slightly to increase in carbon dioxide and hydrogen ion concentration. When these chemoreceptors detect low oxygen, they send afferent signals through the glossopharyngeal and vagus nerves to the medullary respiratory centers in the brainstem. This stimulation then increases ventilation, helping restore normal oxygen, carbon dioxide, and pH levels in the blood. In short, they act like emergency sensors, maintaining blood gas homeostasis when oxygen levels fall. The carotid bodies are found at the bifurcation of the common carotid arteries on both sides of the neck. They send signals through Herring's nerve, which joins the glossopharyngeal nerve, and from there, impulses go to the dorsal medullary respiratory area. The aortic bodies, on the other hand, are located along the arch of the aorta. They send their sensory input through the vagus nerve to the same respiratory area in the medulla. Together, these two sets of receptors provide a quick response system for detecting drops in oxygen and helping the body adjust its breathing. To summarize their locations visually, here on the left, you can see the carotid bodies, which are small clusters of chemoreceptive cells near the bifurcation of the carotid arteries. They monitor the oxygen content of blood flowing to the brain. On the right, we have the aortic bodies situated along the aortic arch. These detect oxygen changes in blood, leaving the heart to the rest of the body. Both sets of receptors send signals through their respective nerves, the glossopharyngeal and vagus nerves directly to the medulla, where respiratory adjustments are made. So while they're small structures, They play a big role in oxygen sensing and reflex control of breathing. Now, let's see how these receptors respond when oxygen levels actually fall. As arterial oxygen concentration decreases, the chemoreceptors are strongly stimulated. This leads to an increase in the nerve impulse rate coming from the carotid bodies, meaning they send faster signals to the brain to increase ventilation. The response is most sensitive when the arterial PO2 drops between 60 and 30 millimeter mercury. This is the critical range where hemoglobin oxygen saturation begins to fall rapidly. As a result, the respiratory center triggers a reflex increase in breathing to restore oxygen levels back to normal. So the chemoreceptors act as the body's low oxygen alarm system. When oxygen levels dip too low, they immediately activate ventilation to protect vital organs. Now, let's look at the basic mechanism of how the carotid and aortic bodies detect low oxygen levels or hypoxia. Both the carotid bodies and the aortic bodies contain specialized cells called glomus cells. These are small, gland-like cells that are extremely sensitive to changes in oxygen concentration. When the oxygen level in the blood falls, the glomus cells act as chemoreceptors. They detect this drop and then stimulate nearby afferent nerve endings, which send signals to the brainstem's respiratory centers. Let's break down what happens inside these glomus cells. Under normal oxygen levels, potassium channels in the glomus cell membrane are open, allowing potassium to move out of the cell. This keeps the cell's electrical state stable. But when PO2 decreases, these oxygen-sensitive potassium channels become inactivated. As a result, potassium can no longer exit the cell, and this leads to cell depolarization. In other words, the inside of the cell becomes more positive. This depolarization is the first step in triggering the release of neurotransmitters that communicate the low oxygen signal to the central nervous system. Let's continue with what happens next, what we call the cellular events during hypoxia. Once the glomus cell becomes depolarized, that electrical change causes voltage-gated calcium channels on the membrane to open. Calcium ions rush into the cell, increasing intracellular calcium levels. This rise in calcium is a signal for the cell to release neurotransmitters, mainly ATP, which acts as the primary excitatory transmitter during hypoxia. In some cases, dopamine or acetylcholine may also play a supporting role. These neurotransmitters are released into the space between the glomus cell and the afferent nerve ending. They bind to receptors on the nerve terminal, which activates the afferent neuron. This neuron then sends signals to the CNS, particularly to the respiratory centers in the medulla, prompting an increase in ventilation. So to summarize, when oxygen levels drop, glomus cells depolarize, calcium enters, neurotransmitters are released, the brain is alerted, and breathing increases. Now that we have discussed how oxygen affects the peripheral chemoreceptors, let's move on how carbon dioxide and hydrogen ions influence breathing. An increase in carbon dioxide or hydrogen ion concentration doesn't only stimulate the brain's central chemoreceptors. It also excites the peripheral chemoreceptors located in the carotid and aortic bodies. When this happens, respiratory activity increases indirectly, helping the body eliminate excess carbon dioxide and restore acid-base balance. However, it's important to note that the central effect, that is the direct stimulation of the respiratory center in the medulla, is about 7 times stronger than the effect from peripheral chemoreceptors. But here's something interesting. Although the central response is stronger, the peripheral response is much faster, up to 5 times quicker. This rapid reaction is crucial during situations like the onset of exercise, when carbon dioxide level rise suddenly and the body needs to adjust ventilation almost immediately. So in summary, the central chemoreceptors are powerful but slower. The peripheral chemoreceptors are weaker but faster, providing a quick first response to carbon dioxide buildup. Together, they ensure that our breathing adjusts both quickly and effectively to maintain proper gas balance in the blood. Now, let's see what happens when arterial oxygen pressure starts to fall. When the oxygen level in the blood decreases or when arterial PO2 becomes low, the peripheral chemoreceptors in the carotid and aortic bodies are immediately stimulated. This stimulation sends signals to the respiratory center, causing an increase in alveolar ventilation, meaning you start to breathe faster and deeper. However, if PO2 is above 100 millimeter mercury, there's little to no change in ventilation. Your body doesn't really react much because oxygen levels are still sufficient for normal metabolism. But when PO2 drops below 100 millimeter mercury, that's when things start to change. As oxygen levels fall to around 60 millimeter mercury, ventilation begins to double. If it drops even further below 40 millimeter mercury, ventilation can increase up to 5 or 6 times the normal rate. This shows how the respiratory system becomes much more sensitive to oxygen changes at lower levels. At these low oxygen pressures, hypoxia becomes the main drive for breathing, taking over from the usual carbon dioxide and hydrogen ion regulation. However, under normal conditions, it's still carbon dioxide and hydrogen ion that serve as the primary regulators of respiration. Now, let's move on to a very interesting concept: acclimatization to low oxygen. When we go to places with high altitude, for example, when climbing a mountain, the air pressure drops and the amount of oxygen available in each breath decreases. This means our body has to adjust to continue supplying enough oxygen to our tissues. People who ascend slowly over several days give their bodies time to adapt. These individuals begin to breathe more deeply and more frequently, which helps maintain oxygen levels in the blood despite the thinner air. Because of this gradual adjustment, they can tolerate much lower atmospheric oxygen compared to those who ascend rapidly. In contrast, people who go up too quickly, like tourists or climbers in a hurry, may experience altitude sickness since their bodies haven't had time to make these adaptations. So, the key takeaway here is slow ascent allows your respiratory system to adapt, while a rapid ascent overwhelms it. Now, let's understand what actually happens inside the body during acclimatization. Within 2 to 3 days at high altitude, The respiratory center in the brainstem, which is normally very sensitive to carbon dioxide and hydrogen ions, loses about 80% of this sensitivity. Under normal conditions, when you breathe faster, you blow up more carbon dioxide. This lowers both carbon dioxide and hydrogen ion levels, which would normally signal the brain to slow down breathing, a process called carbon dioxide inhibition of ventilation. But after several days of exposure to low oxygen, this inhibitory effect of carbon dioxide becomes greatly reduced. This means that low oxygen levels can now drive breathing more strongly without being held back by carbon dioxide control. As a result, alveolar ventilation increases dramatically, far more than during short term exposure. To give you an idea, during acute exposure, ventilation may increase by around 70%. But after 2 to 3 days, it can rise to as much as 400 to 500%. This powerful adaptation greatly improves oxygen delivery to the body and helps people survive and function better at high altitudes. So, in short, acclimatization allows the body to reprogram its respiratory control system to rely more on oxygen rather than carbon dioxide, ensuring survival in low oxygen environments. Now, let's put everything together and look at how carbon dioxide, pH, and oxygen interact to regulate breathing. When the level of carbon dioxide increases, your body immediately responds by increasing ventilation. This is because carbon dioxide directly stimulates the respiratory center to make you breathe faster and deeper. But here's something interesting. When oxygen levels decrease, the body's response to carbon dioxide becomes even stronger. If you look at the graph, you'll see that the curve shifts upward as oxygen falls, meaning that at the same level of carbon dioxide, ventilation is higher when oxygen is low. This tells us that hypoxia or low oxygen actually enhances the ventilatory effect of carbon dioxide. In other words, low oxygen amplifies the body's sensitivity to carbon dioxide, causing a much stronger breathing response. So, when both carbon dioxide is high and oxygen is low, your respiratory drive is greatly stimulated. This is the body's way of protecting itself and ensuring that oxygen delivery and acid base balance are maintained. Let's look closer at how pH also plays a role in this regulation. In the graph, you can see two sets of curves. The red lines represent a normal pH of 7.4, while the blue lines represent a lower pH of 7.3, which indicates acidosis. At this lower pH, the body reacts more strongly to carbon dioxide. As PCO2 increases, ventilation rises sharply, but notice that the blue curve are shifted to the left and upward compared with the red curves. This means that even at lower levels of carbon dioxide, the body starts breathing more rapidly when the pH is lower. So, acidosis enhances ventilation by making the respiratory center more sensitive to carbon dioxide. To summarize, high carbon dioxide, low oxygen, and low pH all work together to increase breathing. This combined effect ensures that the body maintains normal oxygenation and pH balance even during stress, exercise, or disease conditions. Now that we have discussed how gases like oxygen, carbon dioxide, and hydrogen ions regulate breathing under resting conditions, let's move on to a more dynamic situation: exercise. During physical activity, your body's demand for oxygen increases dramatically, while the production of carbon dioxide also rises. Yet, interestingly, despite these big changes in metabolism, your arterial gas levels remain almost constant. This tells us that the body has very precise and well coordinated control mechanisms that adjust respiration immediately as exercise begins. In the next few slides, we'll explore how the brain, muscles, and chemical factors all work together to regulate breathing during exercise, keeping oxygen supply and carbon dioxide removal in perfect balance. Let's talk about what happens to your breathing during exercise. When you begin physical activity, especially strenuous exercise, your body's demand for oxygen and production of carbon dioxide can increase up to 20 times compared to when you are at rest. To meet this demand, your alveolar ventilation, that is the amount of air reaching the alveoli each minute, also increases almost exactly in proportion to the rate of oxygen metabolism. Interestingly, even with such a huge increase in workload, the levels of arterial PO2, PCO2, and pH remain remarkably stable. This means that your body can maintain a normal balance of blood gases even when your muscles are working much harder. If you look at the graph, you'll notice that as oxygen consumption increases, moving from moderate to severe exercise, total ventilation also increases linearly. So, in summary, as exercise intensity rises, ventilation rises proportionally, keeping the blood gases steady and maintaining homeostasis. The respiratory control system is incredibly efficient at adjusting breathing to match your metabolic needs. Now you might be wondering what actually causes this increase in breathing during exercise. Surprisingly, it's not primarily due to changes in blood gases or pH. Instead, it's mainly driven by signals coming from the brain. Here's how it works. When the brain sends motor commands to your skeletal muscles to start moving, it simultaneously sends collateral signals to the respiratory centers in the brainstem. These neural impulses stimulate the respiratory muscles even before any change in oxygen or carbon dioxide levels occurs. This explains why ventilation increases immediately at the start of exercise without waiting for chemical changes in the blood. In terms of mechanism, it's very similar to how the brain controls blood pressure. For example, activating the vasomotor center when we need more circulation. So these neurogenic signals from the higher brain centers and the brainstem are the main drivers of increased ventilation during exercise. Once exercise continues, chemical feedback from carbon dioxide, oxygen, and pH helps fine-tune the breathing pattern, but that initial rise, that immediate response is purely neural in origin. During exercise, both nervous and chemical control mechanisms work hand in hand to regulate breathing efficiently. First, the nervous system takes the lead. Direct neural signals from the brain immediately stimulate the respiratory centers. This ensures that the lungs supply enough oxygen to meet the muscles' increased demands and remove the excess carbon dioxide produced during activity. This neural activation happens almost instantaneously even before significant changes in blood gases occur. Next, the chemical control mechanisms come into play. As exercise continues, small fluctuations in oxygen, carbon dioxide, and hydrogen ion concentrations serve as feedback signals. These chemical factors fine tune ventilation, helping to keep arterial levels of oxygen, carbon dioxide, and pH nearly constant despite the higher metabolic rate. At the start of exercise, breathing increases almost instantly before any rise in arterial carbon dioxide. This happens because the brain anticipates the body's need for oxygen and sends neural signals to stimulate the respiratory centers. Ventilation may overshoot slightly, causing arterial carbon dioxide to drop below normal. This rapid adjustment ensures oxygen delivery and carbon dioxide removal occur immediately. So ventilation rises right away due to neural drive from the brain, not chemical feedback. After about 30 to 40 seconds, the body reaches a steady state. Carbon dioxide released from muscles now matches ventilation, allowing arterial carbon dioxide to normalize. During this phase, chemical control fine tunes breathing to maintain balance of oxygen, carbon dioxide, and pH as exercise continues. Simply put, neural control starts the response and chemical control maintains it. During rest, the lower curve represents the normal relationship between arterial carbon dioxide and ventilation. At this point, the normal arterial PCO2 is around 40 millimeter mercury. When exercise begins, the upper curve shifts upward because of neurogenic stimulation from the respiratory centers. This shift reflects how ventilation increases significantly to meet the demands of heavy exercise. In short, this shows that as physical activity intensifies, ventilation increases to maintain proper gas exchange and prevent carbon dioxide buildup. Neurogenic factors play a key role in regulating breathing during exercise. They cause the ventilatory curve to shift upward, sometimes up to 20-fold, allowing ventilation to match the increased carbon dioxide production so that arterial PCO2 stays near normal. If PCO2 rises above 40 millimeter mercury, it stimulates further ventilation. Conversely, if it drops below 40 millimeter mercury, breathing slows down. Overall, these rapid neural signals ensure that even as metabolism and carbon dioxide production increase, blood gases remain stable. With repeated exercise, the brain learns to fine tune breathing automatically. Over time, this adaptation helps the respiratory system maintain stable PCO2 levels even during intense activity. The cerebral cortex plays an important role in this learned control. If its input is blocked, the trained breathing response also disappears. In short, neural control of ventilation becomes partly a learned adaptation through regular training, allowing athletes to breathe more efficiently during exertion. This concludes our lecture on the regulation of respiration. We have covered how the nervous and chemical systems work together to control breathing, maintain normal blood gas levels, and adjust ventilation during exercise. I hope you were able to follow the discussion and learn from today's topic. Thank you for listening.